Hey, thank you for joining us, and I apologize for that brief delay while we worked on technological issues. We have Daniel Meister here with us tonight. He is the Banting Postdoctoral Fellow at UNB currently, and his paper is Eugenic Roots, Scientific Racism, and Canadian Multiculturalism. Fastest introduction ever.
That suits me just fine. Thank you. Okay, thanks for bearing with us, folks. Our normal technical person is not with us, so we've muddled through and hopefully you can hear me. Yeah, so as a detailed introduction from Leslie covered, I am in the middle of a long-term research project looking at a critical history of Canada's official multiculturalism policy. And the first stage of this project kind of looks at the ideological origins of the policy. And so that research formed my book, which is called The Racial Mosaic. And in that book, I trace ideas about race, immigration, and pluralism in Canada, roughly from Confederation through the 1940s, with a specific focus on the interwar period. And in the peer review I got, I had a kind comment from one who was, other comments suggested they were centrist, but so they said the manuscript forced them to reconsider their understanding of multiculturalism's historical, racial, and even eugenic roots. And I have to admit that that last part of the statement gave me a bit of pause. What I really suggesting contemporary multiculturalism had its roots in eugenics. This wasn't an argument that I had explicitly made, in part due to poor peer review of previous research and articles. In fact, one peer reviewer dismissed any suggestion there was a connection between the two as, quote, a textbook example of an invalid argument. But today I want to go through kind of the arguments I make in the book, and then at the end circle back to this more difficult question about the connection, if any, between multiculturalism and eugenics. And of course, I think the first step is to define what we mean by both these concepts. And so my sneaky mnemonic device is always to take a sip of water. And this gives us the three main definitions of multiculturalism: sociology, ideology, and policy. And I'm going to try to put a clicker on so that I can get into that. More technical. Okay, great. So sociology, if we're talking about sociological multiculturalism, we're just talking about the diversity of a population, people of different racial, ethnic, religious, and cultural origins. We're talking about ideological multiculturalism, on the other hand. We're talking about the belief that multiple cultures can and perhaps should peacefully inhabit a single nation or state. And this sort of implies that immigrants don't need to assimilate, but can and perhaps should retain aspects of their home cultures. And a policy of multiculturalism, of course, just makes official the idea in response to the on-the-ground sociological diversity. And what is meant, of course, by eugenics? I'll steal my definition from Liz's book, as she's our next speaker in the series, and my talk is basically just a big ad for her, so we'll do that. So she defines eugenics as a set of ideas that's based on the underlying belief that humankind can be improved through selective breeding. And eugenicists try to alter human reproduction two main ways: so-called positive eugenics, encouraging supposedly fit or superior individuals to have more children, and negative eugenics referring to attempts to prevent the unfit or supposedly inferior individuals from having children at all. And efforts in these veins ranged all the way from, better baby contests to the involuntary sterilization of the supposedly unfit. But aside from direct efforts to intervene, the idea of eugenics also shaped how generations of people understood human difference, heredity, and worth. And as Costa writes, her brief definition, which I think is great, she says, nevertheless, hardly begins to convey the complexities, fluid nature, or adaptability of these ideas. Indeed, eugenics might be described as a shapeshifter. And I would add that while there's immense value in studying eugenics as as a discrete movement, there's also value in studying eugenics within the broader framework in which it emerged, which is that of scientific racism. And I will not go ahead yet. So while it's theoretically possible that eugenics was about improving the lot of all humankind, the supposed father of eugenics, these folks were really, in practice, interested only in raising the lot of their supposed race of Anglo-Saxons. So it's noteworthy, this quote, for instance, from Francis Galton, who defines eugenics as the study of agencies under social control that may improve or impair the racial qualities of future generations, either physically or mentally. So what do we mean when we talk about race and scientific racism? So this is an equally complex and varied set of ideas. At base, the term scientific racism refers to how race emerged as a supposedly scientific fact and field of study in the last decades of the 19th century, which is to say, the belief that humankind was actually divided into different groups called races. And far from being a simple matter of skin color, as it is often understood today, one's race supposedly determined both physical and mental characteristics, even the geographic regions in which one could safely live. There weren't just believed to be one white race and non-white races, but even multiple white races within Europe, whose markers included eye and hair color, facial characteristics, shape of the skull, as well as a host of behavioral traits. And one of the most common racial schemas has been called Nordicism, and it's moving on this idea that there's three main races in Europe. So there's all these sort of divisions and subdivisions, but it's referring to this kind of level here that there's three main historic races: Nordic, Mediterranean, and Alpine, in that order of superiority, and that Anglo-Saxons and so on were descended from that race, although there's all these complex subdivisions. And so it's important to note that just as eugenics was a grossly oversimplified and distorted understanding of ability and heredity, so too was race science a grossly oversimplified and distorted understanding of human heredity and genetic differences. Of course, the idea of race is, as one scholar put it, it's scientifically incoherent. It's essentially about picking one or more physical characteristics as the most important and then dividing humanity along these lines. Despite the unimportance of the characteristic chosen, the genetic similarities between the various races that this constructs, and the genetic differences within these same races. This isn't to say that race doesn't exist as both a contemporary historical phenomenon, which is socially constructed, which is to say that because people believe races exist, they work to shape society along these lines to the benefit of some and detriment of others, with consequences that extend to the present day. Just light stuff. Speaking of the present day, it's hard to imagine Canada as anything but multicultural now. Multiculturalism has risen from being a minor and controversial policy to a major part of Canadian identity. But Canada wasn't always this way. And so in order to understand how Canada has changed over time and what role scientific racism and eugenics have played, let's conduct a thought experiment and travel back in time exactly 1 century to 1924. So 1924, the last of the numbered treaties has been signed by Indigenous people across Canada under duress due to what historian James Dashik has termed the federal government's politics of starvation. We have the Indian residential school system, which is operating as it always has since its inception, designed to assimilate Indigenous children to English or French Canadian culture, depending on the region. Peter Bryce's expose of the system has been published in 1922, but failed to generate substantive changes. Looking at immigration, we have an Immigration Act that prevents the immigration of any peoples, quote, deemed unsuited to the climate or requirements of Canada. And these restrictions are aimed at people racialized as non-white, and we have subsequent amendments targeting religious minorities, socialists, and those deemed eugenically inferior. The Chinese Immigration Act has just passed, which virtually eliminates all Chinese immigration to Canada. The so-called Gentleman's Agreement with Japan, which voluntarily limited Japanese immigration, has been amended to reduce the total number permitted from 400 people to 150. And finally, we have a continuous journey regulation, which is designed to prevent South Asian immigration and is still in effect despite legal challenges. So looking at the snapshot of cultural and immigration policies and practices from a century ago, it kind of shows two main things. First of all, Canada is first and foremost a settler colony built through the dispossession and suppression of Indigenous peoples and cultures. And second, Canada, for most of its history, has had deeply discriminatory immigration policies, which are essentially attempting to keep Canada as white and British as possible. This is the Canada before multiculturalism. But a very short time later, by 1939, Canadians began to think of themselves as a welcoming mosaic of different races and cultures, which they put in opposition to America's harsh assimilatory melting pot. And so one of the questions my research has been trying to answer is, how did this shift come about in such a relatively short period? And to make a book-long story very short, this is due to massive increase in non-British, non-French European immigration to Canada orchestrated by the federal government, which happens between roughly 1900 and 1930. So basically, English Canadians wanted mostly British people to come to Canada. There was insufficient immigration. The federal government wanted to settle the prairies. They launched a massive advertising campaign in continental Europe and got results. A lot of people started coming into Canada, mostly from the areas that are now Ukraine. And at the time, the presence of these continental Europeans was very, very controversial. And this continued immigration, you can see it's kind of setting some records all throughout these years and moving upwards, upwards, upwards. This triggers a heated debate in Canadian society. Many feared non-British immigrants were a dangerous addition to the country, although fears were on a spectrum. The idea that immigrants would never assimilate and form foreign colonies in the prairies, all the way through to the idea that such people were actually biologically inferior, and as such were a threat to the purity and vitality of the so-called Anglo-Saxon race. So for one example of this sort of xenophobic sentiment, we have no less a respectable figure than the Anglican Bishop of Saskatchewan calling these people's dirty, garlic-smelling continentals. So he's launching this movement to try to restrict immigration to only British people. This sort of crude backlash in turn generates its own defenses of these immigrants, and it's in these defenses that we first get this mosaic ideology, this multicultural ideology first being expressed. The idea that these immigrants should be allowed to come, should be able to retain aspects of their home cultures, and that actually this cultural retention and diversity was beneficial for Canada. So this new belief was expressed in public lectures, radio programs, articles, books, and eventually things like folk festivals. And for the next little bit, I'm going to talk about some of the leading proponents of this idea. And while each differed in their approach, what is important for our purposes tonight is that what they all had in common was an underlying belief in race as a scientific reality, even if not all of them actively advocated for eugenic programs. So first up is John Murray Gibbon. He's probably one of the best known pluralists. He wrote the book Canadian Mosaic, Making of a Northern Nation, which popularized this mosaic metaphor. Gibbon is chief publicist for Canadian Pacific Railway and was long interested in sociological diversity on the prairie provinces, which he described as Europe transplanted. And after he penned several articles on immigration, which you can see here, he then launched a series of folk festivals, which had dual purposes, driving profits for the CPR, but also promoting an understanding of immigrants' rich cultural contributions to Canada. So, he's doing his job. He's also kind of a sincere believer that this is a good thing. He's very much in love with this romantic vision of the prairies. And so in some of these early articles, he uses this garden metaphor. But when he turns to doing background research for the festivals, and then he turns this research into a radio series for the CBC, he uses the mosaic metaphor instead. And in the book that's based on the scripts of this radio program, that's Canadian Mosaic, he opens by turning to race as a way of understanding human diversity. And Gibbon actually is more skeptical than many of his peers about the explanatory power of race, but he still thought it significant enough that he needed to talk about it. And so in his introduction, he concedes there are racial divisions between Europeans. He kind of buys into this Nordicism in that he says, everyone in Europe is descended from Nordic, Mediterranean, or Alpine races. But he suggests these historic races, that a lot of blending between the three had occurred, and so really the only people sort of interested in strict racial categorizations among Europeans were either scientists or, and he's writing in 1938, or the Nazis. And he provides his own definition of race, which he kind of points at both culture and biology and says it's, you know, long period of cohabiting the same location, lots of intermarriage, shared language and culture. Over the centuries, eventually, a physically recognizable and distinct race would sort of pop out. And he says, you know, Canadians aren't there yet. They might become a race someday. And for the races that he's looking at in his book, which there's also some slippage in term between race and races, what we now understand as nationality. He actually is only looking at the white settlers. And so, as he put it here, you know, for various reasons, we're only looking at European races. And he also says the Canadian race of the future is being superimposed over the original Indigenous people, made up of 30 European racial groups, each with its own history, customs, and traditions. And so in addition to his racial exclusion, some scholars have suggested that certain passages in Gibbon's writing reveal sympathy for eugenics. But other remarks about the topic during this period sort of contest or complicate this interpretation. So Gibbon's a novelist on top of his day job at the railway, and they're kind of, you know, these pretty terrible like pulp fiction stuff. So one of his books does suggest some sympathy for so-called positive eugenics, but in the end, it kind of presents the movement as heartless, generally futile. And in another novel, he sort of dismisses eugenics as an extreme, unnecessary movement. Interestingly, he says it's one that only women are interested in and men don't really have any use for. Of course, gender is not actually a factor that decided whether or not an individual would support eugenic ideas. Some women were ardent promoters, some were ambivalent, and some were opposed to the movement. And so our next pluralist kind of falls in this middle category. Kate Foster was a young widowed woman from a relatively wealthy background who around 1917 devotes much of her life to working for the YWCA. She works as a field secretary, and in 1924, she's appointed to the Y's Foreign Born Committee, which had just set out to study the presence of these hotly contested immigrants from continental Europe and to see how they were faring. So she sent across the country to do this national survey, and she publishes the results in 1926. The Y publishes them as Our Canadian Mosaic. So this makes her the first to use the mosaic metaphor that Gibbon later popularizes. He gives her some credit in his book, but he also claims he arrived at the metaphor independently. So in the opening pages of her book, Foster explained that the question of assimilation is bound up with the question of immigration. So she turns to looking at immigration first. She explained Canada's immigration history through the lens of race. And in her mind, the situation was a racial one. So she said, the contacts of races have created new problems, and it's with some of these problems, some of the consequences of migration, that this study is concerned. Canada is composed of two races, she says, English and French. And the reason that Canada is mostly English, not French, in her explanation, is that the French simply aren't an immigrating people. They're homebodies. So Canada is forced to seek out Anglo-Saxons, who are easily assimilated because Canada at this time is a majority British colony. Then she says Canada had moved to seeking out Scandinavians. As we saw in the chart earlier, they're believed to be also members of the Nordic race, so they're, in her words, ethnologically more related to the British stock and therefore more easily assimilated. Lately, she warned, though, there's been a great immigration of Slavic peoples. They were racially dissimilar, more difficult to assimilate, and quite worryingly, they settled in large blocks on the prairies and also in cities and congested areas. She also explains that Canadians never sought out Asian immigrants, not only because they were seen as unassimilable, but they would actually endanger Anglo-Saxon civilization. So despite this racially discriminatory overview of immigration history and her call for even more restrictive immigration regulation, the remainder of the book, which was about the immigrants already in Canada, was actually quite tolerant for its era, although you never guess it from the first few pages. In particular, it makes two novel arguments. The first is that an immigrant group's background did not, quote, lessen our responsibility for the well-being, enlightenment, and development of those who are already among us. So while somewhat patronizing, this stance led her to defend even groups racialized as non-white, particularly Chinese Canadians, and she identified prejudice towards them as largely simply racism. The second was how she defined assimilation. So in her mind, she said assimilation doesn't refer to a forced fusion of races through intermarriage. It doesn't refer to forcing immigrants to sever all their ties to the old world. Instead, it is about incorporating into our national life all the peoples within our borders for their common well-being, working side by side for the common advancement, each race contributing something of value, and so slowly but surely evolving a new people enriched by the diversity of its origin. So, a decade before Gibbon, she's suggesting the same idea that a Canadian race of the future is in the making. This diversity is a positive thing, this is a good thing. And she also is the first to turn to this mosaic metaphor. And in later years, she promotes this vision for the mosaic, or what she describes as goodwill and friendliness, born of mutual respect and confidence between all peoples within our borders. And she promotes this sentiment through an organization she founds called the Council of Friendship. Foster is obviously deeply influenced by ideas about race, although it's harder to discern her ideas about eugenics. But we see some of the language she uses in promoting the Y's work, which implies that she and the organization both were influenced by its ideals. For instance, she repeatedly refers to cultivating clean and wholesome minds and bodies of young girls. And she also delivers an address under the auspices of the Canadian Social Hygiene Council in Toronto, as did prominent eugenicist Helen McMurky, which I believe we'll be speaking about in a couple of weeks. The philosophy of the next pluralist, Robert England, was influenced by the same race science that shaped Gibbon and Foster's analysis, but was also more obviously influenced by eugenic ideals. England, despite his name, is actually an Irish immigrant to Canada, who, after fighting the First World War and then getting an undergraduate degree at Queen's, goes on to work as a school teacher in a rural and predominantly Ukrainian school district in Saskatchewan. And he's never content to stay in one place too long. And so eventually he goes on to France to study psychology and sociology. And at the time he left Saskatchewan, he was alarmed by the slow pace of assimilation and actually suggested that immigration from non-English speaking countries should be halted until all the new Canadians already here were fully assimilated. And so in France, he continues this theme, writing a thesis on the assimilation of Ukrainians in Canada. And so in it, he reflects upon and interprets his experiences in Saskatchewan through the lens of these theories he's studying. As he puts it here, intelligence tests have demonstrated the importance of heredity. There are, psychologists tell us, children with superior intelligence and unfortunately some with an inferior intelligence. We thus learn the strength of the hereditary factor. Man is almost always that which his social environment and heredity make him. It's therefore the duty of the social psychologist to study the social environment. So despite acknowledging the power of heredity, he was more interested in studying and changing the social environment, perhaps because how strong he believed the influence of race was. In a book published in 1929, he expressed a view similar to that that Gibbon would make nearly a decade later, namely that the Nordic Mediterranean Alpine races existed, but much blending had occurred, which made individuals a mosaic of racial characteristics. So in short, England believed that immigrants' behaviors were instinctual and stemmed from their racial heritage, but through education, these instincts could ultimately be harnessed or molded to the benefits of the settler society. And he's quite frank about this. So he says, if we mean by assimilation a process that molds racial stocks into something else, we're flying in the face of what every stock breeder knows. No melting pot can make a Slav an Italian or a Frenchman an Anglo-Saxon. Racial qualities, vices, and instincts will remain, but they may be modified by environment, sublimated into some other form. This is the point at which progress can be made. So England's belief in the power of race and his skepticism in the power of the melting pot led him to affirm the need for the application of eugenic principles to immigration policy. There are undesirables in South Wales as in Southern Europe, he wrote, adding that immigrants to Canada had to belong to the better eugenic types. So far, these cultural pluralists have kind of ranged all the way from eugenic skeptics to accepting the basic tenets of eugenics and hoping that they would be implemented in immigration screening procedures. But at least one was a vocal supporter of both positive and negative eugenic measures. Watson Kirkconnell was born in rural Ontario. He attended Queen's as well, and then he worked in internment operation during the First World War, guarding over a population of internees that was largely either German or Slavic origins. While he's in the army, he also continued his studies independently, studying anthropology. And with the return of peace, he pursued a variety of educational and vocational paths, but was repeatedly blocked by illness. And during one such period of recovery, he authored a lengthy eugenic tract aimed at rural Anglo-Ontarians entitled Anglo-Canadian Futurities. There's a picture of it there, typescript. And so this is deeply rooted in the Nordicist race science that's informed the work of Gibbon and Foster in England. But unlike them, Kirkconnell believed that while most nationalities were a blend of races, British people, or the so-called Anglo-Saxons, were actually racially pure and racially superior. Despite this superiority, though, they were being threatened through the numbers game there because Anglo-Canadians were having too few children. And so he described this phenomenon using the popular term at the time, race suicide. And he placed much of the blame for this racial decline on women, who he argued were rejecting or repressing their proper biological role as women. This is in his words. In the tract's closing reflections, Kirkconnell remarked that the first step in righting the situation in Canada was, weeding out the possibility of reproduction for stocks bearing serious defects, criminality, hereditary diseases of the more fatal types, feeble-mindedness and degeneracy should be made bars to parenthood. Wholesale sterilization of the unfit would be the most effective method, though one likely to meet with furious opposition. Certificates of physical fitness from government medical boards should be made prerequisite for marriage. And the irony here, of course, is that Kirkconnell, as a sickly young man, probably would not be able to obtain such a certificate. The second step, he said, was to cultivate respect for maternity and pride in good heredity, and to discourage what he called neo-Malthusianism, or the practice of birth control. Other positive eugenic measures, none of them original in his tract, included linking a man's salary and the rate at which he was taxed to the size of his family. And on some issues like enlightening the public about their racial duties or facilitating eugenic marriages, Kirkconnell confessed he did not know how best to proceed, though he saw this church and public schools as having an important role to play. And in a later published work, he wrote that the most pressing need of the times is a proper medical inspection of all school children in order to identify the healthy and the defective. 85% of defective students were, quote, curable by the simplest kind of surgical operation. But if these defects were left unchecked, the children will go on to live useless lives and plant the seeds of incurable disease. And so here, Kirkconnell seems to be suggesting that sterilizations ought to begin once intelligence testing had been completed. And intelligence for him was a clear measure of fitness. The only solution for incurable ignorance was to stop the afflicted from reproducing. And in subsequent years, Kirkconnell's thought actually becomes even more extreme before somewhat moderating. In a thesis later published as a book, he tackled the looming problem of unemployment. So this is in the 1920s, looking into the Great Depression ahead. And he argued that unemployment is caused by two factors: fluctuations in trade and imperfections in the quality of laborers. And although he briefly touched on the issue of trade fluctuations, he was far more passionate about the quality of laborers. And his comments in the book suggested that the unemployed were actually a separate class of people. And he provided definitions of subcategories within this class based on individual supposed fitness for industry. And as for solutions to the problem that these unemployed or unemployables represented, he called for the creation of labor colonies where the excess population would be isolated. Attempts would be made, he said, to restore those not beyond salvage, who would then join the national industry under strict supervision. But his newfound understanding of race revealed to him the limitations of such institutions. And so, owing to his belief in heredity, he warned that segregation, quote, serves merely to remove a nuisance from our industrial system. Something had to be done, he said, about the quote, ever-increasing plague of useless and inefficient citizens. And in his mind, there was only one solution. These citizens were to be maintained in lifelong segregation for the preservation of society, and for the same profound and fundamental reason, they should be prevented through surgical sterilization from reproducing their worthless kind. No single act by a modern state could so improve its hopes of permanence and advancements in the social scale. He asserted that the state should be charged with this vital task, but because, quote, the plague is international in its activities, a concerted effort was required. So once concerned only with kind of Canada and specifically rural Ontario, he now advocated eugenic measures, regulation, segregation, and sterilization on an international scale. Now, within a short time, owing to a move to the more sociologically diverse city of Winnipeg, to begin work as a professor of English, and due to the tragic loss of his first wife, Kirkconnell backed away from some of the extremes of his racism, and he now argued the same as Gibbon and others, that all nationalities, including the British, were racial mixtures, and he also adopted this new idea that the racial intermixture was a source of strength. So this new belief led him to spend a lot of time translating poetry from European languages into English, and eventually focusing on the translating and promoting the literary contributions of the so-called Canadians. So a staunch defense of continental Europeans like Ukrainians, Hungarians, Icelanders, and others from the 1920s, late 1920s onwards, was significant. He did a lot of work in this vein. We shouldn't overlook that. But we equally should not shy away from acknowledging that for the rest of his life, including during his tenure as president of Acadia University here in Nova Scotia, he retained a crude racist belief that all peoples considered white were superior to all others. And while he declined to participate in the heated debates over whether or not Manitoba should adopt eugenic legislation, for instance, he privately harbored eugenic concerns that would sometimes come to the fore, such as during the Second World War, when he remarked that Anglo-Canadians had, quote, chosen present comfort at the price of racial extinction and were addicted to race suicide. So to quickly recap, these philosophies of cultural pluralism are developed largely in response to changing immigration patterns and demographics in Canada, and as such as a settler colonial project. It's a way of making English Canadians comfortable about these continental Europeans that are coming into settled prairies. And this heated debate that this immigration triggers sparks this backlash and leads to these public intellectuals to defend recent immigrants and Canadians of Southern and Eastern European descent specifically. But as we've seen, all of them worked within this framework of race science or scientific racism, which dictated that at minimum, all people racialized as non-white were inferior to those racialized as white. And the supposedly scientific framework also helped construct hierarchy among the supposedly white races. And many of these pluralists, as we've seen, reached their new position of tolerance not through an outright rejection of the underlying framework of race, but rather tweaking it, making the argument that so much racial mixing had occurred that the pursuit of racial purity was a fruitless and ultimately a necessary task, and also arguing that this mixture might actually be beneficial. And eugenics was an important part of scientific racism because it focused on creating still more perfect races through the regulation of the reproductive process. The idea that eugenic principles should shape the immigration process was seen by many to be nothing more than common sense or following the latest science. Although the example of these four makes it clear that just how seriously eugenics ought to be taken was seen as a matter for debate. And while time prevents me from giving or I say that, everyone's like, oh, good, it won't be much longer. Yes, time prevents me from providing the history of the rest of the next 3 decades, from the 40s all the way to 71. And when we get an official policy of multiculturalism, I want to just very quickly touch on the context in which the policy emerged. So cultural pluralism, this kind of mosaic idea as an unofficial policy and practice held throughout the 50s and well into the 60s. And Prime Minister Diefenbaker's philosophy is kind of emblematic of the period. his underlying philosophy summed up in 2 words: one Canada is the name of his memoirs. And so, he was a mostly assimilated German heritage, but he argued that people should take great pride in this, in their background, and even preserve their cultures. But the important part was that they wouldn't make any special demands of the state. They should consider themselves citizens of a single united nation. They were Canadians. And so I think this kind of philosophy would have held all the way until the late 1970s, when we finally have non-European immigration beginning to outstrip European. But what happens, the wrinkle in here is the 60s, the onset of the Quiet Revolution, and the rise of nationalism and separatism in Quebec. And so as part of the response to this perceived crisis of national unity, the federal government agrees to strike this Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism. The commission has its terms of reference to examine the state of English-French bilingualism and biculturalism in Canada, taking into account the contribution made by the other ethnic groups. This sort of tacked on, oh yes, we should look at other folks as well. And these other ethnic groups were not happy with the notion of biculturalism. Where did they fit into it? Had they not done the hard work of settling the prairies? Did that not make them a founding race too? And so it was that the very people whose admission had been so contentious, predominantly Ukrainian Canadians, led a strong protest against this Royal Commission. And if we were to sum up all their advocacy, basically, they reject the idea that Canada is bicultural, and they propose the idea that Canada is multicultural, and there's really no agreement what this means other than just that admitting Canada has more people groups than just English and French. So these are a couple reports from conferences that were held and some of the press coverage that they got fighting against biculturalism. And so here we see kind of a clear line between the early philosophies of cultural pluralism and the arguments that these activists employed. They had taken seriously the notion that they were strong contributors to Canadian society, and they demanded recognition of this. And so in response, the Commission dedicates the 4th volume of their report to these other ethnic groups, but they don't allow themselves to be swayed by the argument. So they were given bilingualism, biculturalism, and that's what they stuck with. They're stuck with their terms of reference. So they said, when they talk about multiculturalism, they just say we have to acknowledge there's 2 main cultural groups, keeping in mind the others. So this book comes out, groups continue to protest against it. The federal government now has to respond publicly. So this gets passed off to civil servants, and they are trying to square the circle of biculturalism versus multiculturalism, and they come up with an interesting compromise. Multiculturalism, but within an English-French bilingual framework. So not moving away from bilingualism, which they've just implemented through the Official Languages Act, but acknowledging the argument of these other ethnic groups. And so the policy is kind of 4 planks. It ensures that ethnic groups will be offered assistance to preserve their cultures. They'll be encouraged to share their cultures with others, and they'll be helped to fully participate in Canadian society, overcome cultural barriers, and help to learn at least one of Canada's official languages. And so at this point in my research and argument that people have argued, it's clear, okay, sure, the ideas from long ago in the 20s and 30s were influenced by race science and eugenics, but there's no tie between that early, just tasteful history and the modern policy. But here I would return to the point that's made by Kate Foster in one of the earliest works of pluralism in Canada, who points out that there's a tie between immigration policies and cultural policies, whether it be assimilation or culturalism. Because it's immigration policies that dictate what cultural and ethnic groups are allowed to enter the country and share their cultural values with others in the first place. So multiculturalism, in a way, is about what cultures count. Immigration policy is about what bodies count. And so when we put this history of multiculturalism in the context of the longer history of policies and practices relating to Canadian immigration, we see that these practices and policies have never been value neutral. So as the scholar of disability studies, Jay Dolmich, puts it, immigration has never been about immigration. Yes, immigration restriction has always had real tangible effects. It reaches into and rearranges bodies violently. And we have images, laws, manuscript maps, and other documents to reveal the ways that immigration restriction in North America shaped geographies, populations, and institutions all over the world. We can also tie immigration restriction to larger ideologies like racialization, eugenics, and xenophobia. So if we accept Jay's broader definition or viewpoint and consider the ways in which eugenics changed how Canadian society thought about the value of bodies, we see that, as disability scholars have long argued, eugenic ideas informed Canadian immigration, and Canadian immigration policies discriminated on ableist grounds since the very first policies were drafted. So from the very first 1869 Act all the way through 2001, all Canadian immigration legislation either outright barred or placed special restrictions on the admission of those deemed physically or mentally defective. And the 1976 Act introduced a new clause which held that immigrants could be turned away if, quote, their admission would cause or might reasonably be expected to cause excessive demands on health or social services. So this now infamous excessive demands clause was retained in the subsequent Act of 2001. So clearly, Canada's immigration policy has long mirrored this older eugenic logic. In conclusion, if the early cultural pluralists were imagining a racial mosaic, they were also imagining a eugenic one. Canadian nation composed of only perfect tiles, or of minds and bodies considered to be fit. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to, if you shut off the camera and the volume on yours,
Yes.
I will switch it around. There. Okay.
Okay.
We should. Oh, we're still viewing your screen.
I was too hasty. How's that?
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so we are going to open it up to questions here. You can raise your hand or alternately put your chat, your question in the chat, and it should switch to that camera. Okay, there we go. Check and see if we have any questions in person. Not to turn the spotlight.
Yeah, no pressure.
No pressure. We have somebody just joining. Are there any questions in the chat or with our attendees, virtual attendees?
I have one.
Oh,
Yeah.
excellent, thank you.
I'm curious if what things you discovered as you were doing the research were surprising to you. Like, were there any things that changed your notion of what you thought you would see while you were doing the research?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I didn't plan to say the topic at all. I was studying. I started with the one figure, Watson Kirkconnell, the last one, and I was looking at his role in the Cold War because he was a very, very hyperactive anti-communist figure, one of the earliest and most outspoken. And then when I was, because I'm kind of like a plodding empiricist, so I started at the beginning of his life and like digging through, and I found all these wild writings about eugenics and racism and scientific racism and all. And nobody really talked about it. Instead, he had this reputation like in the Baptist history literature as he's this tolerant guy who does all this great translation work. And so from the outset, I was kind of shocked at like that this material existed, like at one of those like learning history just by being in the archive going, oh, why has no one talked about this? And then it was just such a strange experience to look at each of the other pluralists and find the same idea. They just start, if they open a conversation with diversity, they start talking about race, different European races, all the stuff. And then there wasn't a lot of literature by Canadian historians that talked about it. So I was reading American stuff to try to figure out what are these guys talking about? Who are all these? Because a lot of these, there's different racial schema that were made, and it's very convoluted and hard to follow, and very surprised that someone hadn't written about it yet. So it was kind of like a baptism by fire into the history of scientific racism in Canada. So the whole thing to begin with was a surprise. I wanted to read about anti-communism, and I ended up reading all this wild scientific racism. So it was a very strange experience. It all started in the archives of Acadia. So yeah.
I have a question. Oh, I'm sorry, like.
So you went first.
Now I'm really intrigued. I had something else entirely, but you started looking at anti-communist work and then found, is there a relationship between the anti-communist ideologies and the scientific racism, or are they just two separate parts of what he's invested in?
Like the way that I understand it is it's conspiratorial thinking brings together random camps together. And so I think that he's he's kind of a lost young man. He's sick. He's in the First World War. He wants to go overseas and fight. His brother goes over and dies. And he's rejected. He tries 3 times to get past the inspection board. They won't let him. And so he kind of, when he comes to race science, I think it's like this hidden knowledge, like I understand how the world works and it's being suppressed, that kind of idea. And that's why he, in the bedroom of this like childhood home, he's banging on a typewriter, like this idea, warning, Anglo Ontarians, beware, like, your population is imperiled. And so I think that when he gets onto communism, and in a way, he's right about some things in the sense that he can read some of the, like, from his translation work, so he can read sources. So he's reading, Russian newspapers, or whatever, and going, oh my, these people are intent on actually taking over the world. And so I think that because he had found something more substantial, that really fueled this sort of paranoid or conspiratorial minded sort of bent in him.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's as much as I can give it. But.
We have another question in the room, and then I'll switch over to the ones online here.
I enjoyed your talk, thank you. That was very interesting. I guess if I could, I'd ask 2 questions. The first is about the idea of mosaic, which is something I kind of grew up with and never really thought of where it came from. And I'm wondering whether the early adopters of that term borrowed it from somewhere else. Are there other jurisdictions that have used mosaic, or is this kind of a Canadian invention to try to capture this idea?
To my knowledge, it is like a Canadian invention. So there's one other, like, for whatever reason, because it's famous, like everyone's trying to claim it. So there's another Victoria Hayward is a American travel writer, and she visits and she uses the term, but she uses specifically about the architecture of the prairie. So looking at all the different types of churches and Orthodox, or she says this is sort of this mosaic of all these kind of rooftops and steeples, and so that's the best I could give. But no, so far as I know, it's a Canadian conception, and I'm not sure how. Gibbon just says I came onto it, and then I think when he found out others had used it, he mentions Hayward's book, he mentions Foster's book, and he writes to Foster about it. But Foster is the only one that really, or the first one to really dig in. Like, she is kind of like, she cites this authority on like this old text on how to make mosaics, and so she kind of really unpacks this, like the important principles of having a good design and proportion and all this, like very, very detailed. So I think she, rightly gets credit for coining it, and also she, for whatever, I don't know how she got onto it, but she was very serious about it as a metaphor, like, it had all these implications, not just it was a nice idea. So yeah.
The second question I had is it's a little unfair because it's taking you away from the research a little bit, but I went to Acadia.
Okay.
So I always, heard this name, Kirkconnell, and as an undergrad student, of course, really didn't pay any attention. He was just this old guy who used to run the place or whatever.
Yeah.
And you're obviously digging up some kind of unpleasant things about it. I'm wondering if Acadia's been, what was known about this before you started this research, and whether there's any wrestling at Acadia now that you know of the legacy of Kirkconnell, and that could. I assume there's still Kirkconnell scholarships. Isn't there? I think there's a building. Isn't there a building?
Yeah. So the reading room that I did the research in is the Watson Kirkconnell reading room.
Right.
Yeah.
So I mean, any sense of whether this is
yeah,
I encourage them to kind of rethink some of this.
I don't know. There was one article Jack Lipinski, who looked at Canadian Jewish studies,
Mhm.
and he kind of dug up this troubling anti-Semitism in Kirkconnell's later life that people had missed. And in this early stuff, Kirkconnell is also quite anti-Semitic, as is Gibbon. Gibbon moves away from it. Kirkconnell seems to kind of leave it and then come back to it.
Mhm.
And so he had published that, and no one really picked up on the article for whatever reason.
Right.
And then, yeah, there's still some sort of a scholarship or prize, local history prize,
Mhm.
and it's still the reading room. But if there are discussions going on, I haven't heard about it. I kind of wondered if maybe, because he also is at Order of Canada,
Mhm.
so I wondered that when this stuff started to come out about, former Nazis
Right.
being appointed that Oregon as well, that this might trigger some discussion, but if it's happening, I'm not in the loop, I guess.
I'm
So,
curious.
yeah, yeah.
Forthcoming.
Forthcoming, yeah, that's right.
Okay, so we've got a question from Susan Jowdy, who asked whether the individuals ever make an economic financial argument as to the cost of certain immigrants in relation to fit.
Oh, that's a great question and difficult. Yeah, so like a lot of it's I mean, the political economy angle is sort of most on Gibbon and the railway workers. So Robert England, I don't know if I mentioned, also works for the rival Canadian National Railways. So they both, like, Gibbon believes, he's a true believer from the outset. England kind of believes, once he starts working for the company, that all this immigration is beneficial. But like the companies they're working for make their money bringing these people on steamships, bringing them across the rails, selling them land, getting people to stay at the hotels for these festivals. So there's a financial incentive for them, but they don't really talk about that a lot. One of the more curious and kind of perverse economic arguments that I came across, which is not original to Robert England, he cites someone else, Smith, on it, I think, but they argue that the Chinese head tax is effective because they can take that money and it's paying for the promotion or the advertising scheme to get at least continental Europeans in. So that was kind of one of the few overt economic and gross arguments that was made. But he makes this in a paper he gives to I think in a railway association. So it's not like a public thing that's really talked about. But in the book I talk a bit about just the kind of wheeling and dealing that Gibbon does, like works with anthropologist Marius Barbeau to promote people coming even to see Indigenous festivals in the Banff region and stuff. So, which is really fascinating, right? Because like in this time, all those festivals are supposed to be banned, but he gets kind of a special dispensation from Duncan Campbell Scott to do this, which is really just about making, driving tourism to Banff. So this is going on, but it's kind of not really talked about, but it's pretty obvious, and 2 of the 4 are directly connected to the biggest corporations in Canada this time, the railways.
Oh, it's so nefarious and interesting.
Yeah.
We have a question from Lynn, who just asked if you could clarify the point that residential schools ran until 1947. And I don't think that's what you meant. It was just the date that you had bracketing the policy you were looking at. She says because residential schools ended because the last one closed in 1993.
Yeah, no, that's totally correct. And I can't remember what's on the side or why, but it might have been talking about when it was strictly compulsory. I'm not sure. But yeah. But no, that's entirely correct.
Absolutely. Do we have any other questions coming online? Looking like a quiet evening. Well, I am going to thank Daniel for his talk and, oh, that's just Courtney saying, thank you so much, Daniel, for your wonderful talk.
Thanks for being here, Courtney.
Question.
Oh, yeah, it's okay.
About 10 or 15 years ago, I don't know where it was, but someone told me about a bunch of eugenics research that was going on in Dalhousie back in the day.
Okay.
And I was wondering if while you were doing your work, if you came across any similar things at Acadia or any of the other universities, because I know now they're working on this process in Acadia to decolonize the institution. And I'm wondering if they're addressing that history as well, or just the relationship with Indigenous people.
Yeah.
If you know about that, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I don't. Leslie, do you?
I don't know about Acadia, and I'm not, it seems to be happening separately at the different institutions. Dalhousie has ties to some of the early eugenicists in Nova Scotia that they're working through. And Mount Allison that Susan Jaffrey presented on last week. We're going to put the video up online if you weren't able to watch it then. It had some really interesting ties too. So I think it might be something that all the institutions are kind of dealing with in their individual ways right now. But for
Yeah.
Acadia, I don't know anything specifically.
Yeah, and I don't even know what sort of efforts, like decolonization efforts are underway there. I'm not sure. I mean, I started with Kirkconnell, so that was the longest to go, and then I kind of moved on to the other figures, and I just actually finished doing the Kate Foster one. So that's a great question. I should actually dig in and see what's going on. Yeah. Thanks.
So interesting. Well, we have lots of things for a wonderful talk. And thank you everyone for joining on what is probably the last day of classes for many people. And I apologize for setting it on this day to
It's all
Daniel and
good.
everyone else.
Thanks, everyone.
Whoops, and now we have a Sidney Crosby pop up on the screen, which is amazing. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to